Today we have for your viewing pleasure the most take no prisoners, hardcore Christian apologist this side of side 10 Bruggencate. This guy, if you are an atheist, particularly JB or deconverted man, wherever they may be, if you are an atheist, this guy doesn't just want to beat you in an argument, he wants to hurt you. He wants to make you suffer. And welcome, please, the dry apologist. Woo! Oh my God, the dry apologist.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Is it Caleb? Caleb is your first name?
Yes.
You are welcome. Tell us what you do, who you are, and what you do.
Yeah, so I have a YouTube channel. I've changed the name recently to Apologetic Showdown and just host some philosophical apologetic related discussions and hoping to host some debates coming up. And yeah, so anybody who wants to come on that channel is welcome to. And that's what I do.
Cool. And you seem to have, from what I've noticed, I've watched you in like 2 or 3 debates. You seem to have a pretty good philosophical background. Why don't you tell us a little bit about, when you became a Christian and like what you do exactly in terms of your knowledge base?
Yeah, I'm raised Catholic and I'm still a practicing Catholic. And when I got to college, I started to get interested in apologetics and studied philosophy and religious studies. And then went and got a master's in theology so that I could teach high school theology, which I did for a little while, and then had to move, so I don't do that at the moment. But yeah, that's kind of my background there.
Yeah, I kind of got that when I've heard you in debates. I kind of got the sense that you were pretty well versed in a lot of these things, more than most people. So tell us about your deal now? You have a apologetics channel, and what are you trying to do?
Yeah, Apologetics Showdown, and then yeah, basically I just want to have open, honest dialogues with people, especially in regards to like theism, Christianity, and atheism, agnosticism is really what I enjoy discussing. And I've already had some really great guests on recently, and hope to have more discussions. I have at least one debate scheduled coming up, and yeah, so I typically stream on Thursday nights now. And yeah,
yes, I noticed that because you used to do Sundays, and I've always been intending to drop by, but Sundays isn't a good day for me to just casually drop by. But Thursdays I definitely will, maybe even tomorrow. Who have you had on recently? What debates have you had on that are of note that we should probably check out?
Yeah, a while back before I changed the channel, I had a couple of discussions with Jordan Finley, who I met on Twitter, and those are pretty good. And then recently I had Camille Gregor on to explain his naturalistic hypothesis of the resurrection argument. And that was a good discussion. And then I had Ben Watkins on to go over arguments for God. And then last Sunday I had JD Agnostic on, who I also met on Twitter. And we discussed various things. So I thought all of those were really good discussions. And yeah, I would recommend checking them all out. And then I've had some various just live hangouts.
Yeah, I noticed you were in a stream with Alex Malpass on Converse Contenders. Yeah. I watched about half of that.
Yeah,
that's pretty high end. I mean, that guy's really first rate intellect. And I was just impressed that you were able to hold your own with him. To be quite honest with you.
Thanks. Yeah, I've had a number of debates. I've been on Modern Day Debate a handful of times, and then Converse, and then I was on the Magic Sandwich Show and I was on Deconverted Man's channel and Math Pig. So yeah, I've jumped around a lot. But yeah, my discussion with Alex was a really good challenge, and that's helped me rework my ideas. All my discussions, I always walk away from them, tinkering with my ideas some more, trying to find better ways to communicate them, and if I need to rework it and everything. I'm really wanting to find the truth and hash out these ideas. I'm open to criticism and such. I change my arguments all the time. So
yes, I noticed that. JB, we want to try to set up something with you and him. Is JB still in the live stream? We want to set up something with on this channel with you and him. So if you want to do that, if that's how you want to break into your career as a counter apologist, we know that it's only your first stream, so it'll just be a nice little chit chat. It won't be like a debate or anything. I don't know if you heard me. Did you hear me? Now,
Yeah.
okay, so let's talk. The first thing let's go over, you mentioned in one of your, I think it was a comment to me about the Phaser 5 proofs. Now, you read the book. I don't want to go too in depth with it, but if you can give us an overview of the arguments and which ones you like and why, and just however in depth you want to go.
Sure. Yeah, I'm a pretty big fan of Phaser. I've read a number of his books, and I find him to be pretty solid. And I've kind of tracked his arguments over the years. And I think
that's what I got from your comment, that you were actually really into it. So I'll give you an opportunity to fill us in.
Yeah, and yeah, I could go in really in depth on some of his ideas, but yeah, basically with the 5 proofs book, he gives these 5 different arguments, which 4 of them are cosmological, contingency type arguments, and then one of them's a more transcendental, Augustinian type argument. And
that's the one that I cite, right? The argument from eternal truth.
Right.
And
I think,
we'll go into depth on that, and then just give us a background on the others.
Sure. And I think all of them have something to be said for them. I guess if I were to give a breakdown just of the cosmological types, I think that the rationalist Leibnizian type is the strongest, and that's more in line with the way that I argue it. Then I'd probably say the prime mover type Aristotelian argument's the next strongest. Then I would say the essence existence Thomistic type is the third, and then the weakest to me was the Neoplatonic. And basically, I think they all take the same form, which Phaser, of course, would concede. I think they all have plausible objections, but I do think the Leibnizian type is the best.
And so break down the Leibnizian.
Sure.
Now, give us also, because some of these, if you can tell us, if you can give us like as much as you know, feel free, because I think you have a pretty good background. Like you could even fill people in who Leibniz is, and even some of the I believe the book Candide was written as a response to him. I don't know if that's true, but anyways, go ahead.
Yeah, and I'm not an expert on Leibniz, but I can give a little bit of background. So Voltaire wrote his sort of book mocking Leibniz, Theodicy, his book named Theodicy, where we get that word from. But Leibniz was a major, mathematician and philosopher, among other things, during the Enlightenment, and he kind of expanded upon, with his cosmological argument, he expanded upon the earlier cosmological types presented by Aquinas, Augustine, Scotus, and so on. But what's interesting, I think what's stronger about his version is that he doesn't incorporate some of the more Platonic elements that their versions had, which, with the Enlightenment, Platonism was really done away with. So Leibniz recasts this argument without that kind of Platonism going on. And I think that makes the argument stronger. Now, more classical inclined philosophers like Thomas and like Phaser are going to push back. They would probably say he made it weaker, but I think most would agree that, at least who are more in line with modern philosophy, that he made the argument stronger, and I would agree. But so that's kind of the background with that. Now, the other arguments are more in spirit of what these people argued. So Phaser's giving a kind of traditional interpretation. It's not quite what these people said, but Aquinas did give an essence existence argument in his book, Essence, or I think it's called Essence and Existence, or On Being and Existence, something like that. And Phaser argues that that's what's also going on within the 5 ways, or at least within the second and third of the 5 ways in the Summa. And so basically he calls it the Thomistic argument. But and then so that argument has some kind of origins historically with Thomas Aquinas, and then the Neoplatonic goes back, at least in some sense, to Plotinus, I believe, who was a Greek philosopher. And then there is the prime mover, which Aquinas, of course, argues for in his first way in the Summa, and also in his other Summa, Contra Gentiles, as well. And that also goes back to Aristotle. And so that's where he calls it the Aristotelian, even though Aquinas and I think Maimonides and others argued for it as well. So anyways, they all have this sort of historical origin with these thinkers. And then, yeah, so Phaser kind of just builds upon them all and then responds to more modern objections to them.
And what can you give us the summation of like the Leibniz argument? Can you break down that?
Well, yeah, pretty much with all four of them, they all take the same form. So basically that we can find contingent or finite type things in the universe, and these things, Phaser argues that they need a cause, but there can't be an infinite regress of a cause. And it's not a cause going back in time, but a cause of their very existence in this very moment. But the Aristotelian version works with the principle of act and potency, or also motion would be the idea. The Neoplatonic or Plotinus argument argues from parts, and then the essence existence argues from the distinction between essence and existence. And then the Leibnizian one argues from contingency, or more like modal contingency. So, explanation of why something is the way that it is. And then Phaser says there can't be an infinite regress within these types of causes. And so then eventually you get to something that doesn't have a combination of act and potency, doesn't have a combination of essence existence, doesn't have material parts, doesn't have some explanation for why it is the way that it is, because it's a necessary thing. So each one of them have the same form, but I think the Leibnizian one is the best in its causal principle, that it gets to this necessary being. I think it does it the most plausibly. So that's why I think it's the best of those four.
And what you said that those one of the standard critiques of some other people would be that it's actually because it doesn't rely on, what did you say originally, that it doesn't rely on Neoplatonism, and that's why you like it?
Well, yeah, it doesn't incorporate these Platonic kind of elements like act and potency. And some people would maybe push back on me saying that those are Platonic, but they do have a kind of moderate Platonism going on. And by that, I mean invoking some sort of aspect of being that's not within the material world. So saying that something has a form, or saying that something, and I guess the Neoplatonic one doesn't, but you find that it kind of does. Or saying that something has an essence. And these claims weaken the argument, because not only do you have to argue the argument, but you have to then argue for this kind of moderate Platonism. And I know that in the Five Proofs book, Phaser argues that the Aristotelian argument can be made without appealing to those notions, but actually that weakens the argument. So, or at least you can make the case that it does. So, they're not as strong.
Now, two questions. I've only watched a couple of your debates. Have you tried these arguments in actual debates with pushback from atheists? And did you pretty sure you watched the Phaser Oppie, the last debate with them on capturing Christianity. So what did you think of that? Mm-hmm. And have you shopped in any of these debates? And have you tried them on the in debate? And how'd that go?
I haven't tried these specific debates in my live debates, because I've debated online like years before I got into YouTube stuff, and I have tried the arguments and came to see a lot of these objections and such. But in my personal, like the debates you can find where I argue online, the closest that I argue for would be this Leibnizian type argument. But my version each time I've presented it's been a little bit different. It's never been totally what Leibniz argued or what Phaser argues, but it's in that kind of spirit. But yeah, I watched both of the Phaser's discussion with Oppie, and I thought that, well, the first one to me was more constructive because it was more about the arguments, and that second discussion was more about methodology. And to me, well, they did talk a little bit.
They laid a lot of groundwork.
And to me, it wasn't as productive from my standpoint. They did get it back into the arguments towards the end, but to me, it was the first discussion was more fruitful about natural theology, I thought. But yeah, I mean, basically, Oppie, I think, makes two really he makes one major objection to that because the Aristotelian argument was discussed in the first one for most, or at least half of the time, and then it was discussed for.
Isn't that also what they started talking about Isn't that what they started talking about in the second one?
At towards
Also,
the
like
end, yeah.
there was right, but
Yeah,
they spent
towards
about an
the end.
hour and 15 minutes. And they spent the first hour and 15 minutes was just like, you know, basically
Right.
laying the groundwork for the discussion to follow. And then like, the discussion to follow was like 20 minutes on the actual argument.
Mm, right. And I wish they hadn't have
Go
done
ahead.
that, but yeah, it's not to say the first part of the discussion that second time wasn't important, but it wasn't really as germane, I thought. But basically, Oppie seems like his main objection to this Aristotelian proof is to argue for what's called existential inertia. So this idea can take different forms, but it's kind of the idea, we think of like physical inertia, like if you throw an object, it's going to continue its course because, and we would say it's a
Right.
law of inertia. Well, there's the idea that something stays in existence, even if it's not a necessary thing. It could be a contingent thing, so it doesn't have to exist. But once it does exist, or given that it does exist, it'll keep existing, not because something causes it to exist, but rather because that's just its state, that's just its default state. It's like an object in motion stays in motion. Well, you could say an object in existence stays in existence. And it seems like Oppie also kind of defends this by appealing to a kind of regressive causes, like prior states could initiate the next state and so on. So there are different ways to argue for it, but he was arguing that undermined this Aristotelian argument. And if one finds existential inertia to be plausible, it does seem like it could serve as an undercutting defeater of that argument.
Now, some comment today that like we were discussing in relation to these type of arguments that what did you say to me? You kind of agreed with what I said about Nathan, where he was objecting that there are flaws in a lot of these arguments and they don't successfully prove God. And the objection, I mean, I get it, I get the objections, but it doesn't necessarily follow. Therefore, God doesn't exist because these arguments haven't been constructed to the point where they successfully prove God. You kind of agreed with me on that.
Yeah.
At least what you said in the
Well,
comments.
there's a couple of things there because I was watching some of your stream earlier, and then Pine Creek was seeming to push back, saying like, well, they're taking a more weak atheist position where it's like, the argument, not having a good argument doesn't thereby mean God doesn't exist. But if you don't have a strong argument, then you should take you're not, the weak atheist position. I don't agree with that, but that's kind of where I think a lot of atheists are coming from, and at least I understand the consistency of what they're saying, though I would challenge their epistemology. But I would say though
Right,
that
but the problem is that a lot of them, like, did you watch the Tyler Vila Matt Dillahunty debate, right?
yeah.
What'd you think of that? What do you think of that tag argument? And what
Well,
did
yeah,
you
and
think
then
of that
that gets
debate?
right. Then that gets into that other. It's very, so that tag argument is very similar to the other proof, that Phaser covers. And by proof, I
Right,
just want to.
that's the art. The other proof is the argument from eternal truth. It's very similar to the tag argument, right?
Right.
That's what you're talking about.
Yeah,
The
and by
fourth one in the
proof,
phasers. Yeah.
I do want to point out that Phaser would say by proof, it doesn't necessarily mean everybody's convinced. It means that it is a deductive syllogism, that if you accept it, the conclusion would follow. But Phaser does seem to really think that they pretty much follow. So, because I know that you raised that point about, are they proofs or not? It depends on how that word is used. But yeah, he presents that argument,
Well,
eternal.
actually, Vela was arguing that too. He was using the word abductive, which by
Right.
definition means you ain't proving it.
Well, yeah,
Go
but
ahead. I'm sorry. Go.
Phaser doesn't argue abductively, as far as I can tell. But yeah, I agree. Anyway, that's a side point. But yeah, that argument that there are these necessary sort of abstractions like laws of logic and so on, and that these are like ideas, or I like how you put it, actually, like mind-like. They have a mind-like quality to them, and
Right.
therefore it would at least plausibly imply that they're grounded in this necessary mind. And to me,
Right.
that actually does intuitively seem really plausible. And there was a time I was really convinced by that type of argument. I thought that was like a really good way to argue. But I've been convinced out of that because it raises. So I had a discussion with Ben Watkins last week on my channel, and we go through the moral argument, but I see it being very similar to this type of reasoning. And it runs into this Euthyphro kind of problem where, if you have something else that grounds something necessary, then the truths are no longer necessary. But if they're no longer necessary, that kind of deflates the argument. But if they're necessary, then you don't need something, it seems at least, you don't need something else to ground it if it's a necessary truth.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
that was Matt Dillahunty's kind of objection, is that, and I get the objection. That's why I said the argument isn't really successful as framed. The reason why I like the argument is that there are laws of logic that are inviolate and, as far as we know, transcendent, which means they're not dependent on time. And that automatically starts to already sound like theological framing. They don't prove that there's a God, but it kind of leads you in that direction. That's why I like the argument. That's why I say it's like 70% of the way there, and it needs to be reconstructed.
Yeah.
Makes sense what I just said.
You're kind of cutting out, Craig. But I was going to ask you, you were saying necessary. I know that in your favorite argument for God, the contingency argument, there's sort of different ways in which you can think about necessity and contingency. I was just curious then, when you're saying that the laws of logic are necessary, are you meaning that they could exist independent of God even? Because I know there's certain things that even I think Tyler Vila would say that they're dependent on God, but they're also necessary in that they're true in all possible worlds. Mm-hmm. But you think that they're necessary and independent, I guess.
Right. Well, yeah, something can be necessary instead of dependent on God. I'm willing to concede that when I argue the cosmological argument, but that's something concrete. But a truth can't be necessary and dependent upon something else. So in this sense, when we say it's necessary, it's true in every possible world. And the reason for that would be just thinking about the nature of truth. If I were to say 1 + 1 = 2, if that really depended upon something, then that would imply that there's a possible world in which that could have failed to be the case. And that would just seem false. It would take away its necessity. So it gets kind of technical, but yeah, necessary meaning couldn't have been otherwise is typically how the word's used. So if you think something like 1 + 1 = 2, could that have been otherwise? And it seems obviously no. But if that's the case, it doesn't depend upon anything else. So it would seem, right, at least. And I know that Tyler.
Well, we have to prove that's the problem.
Yeah, go ahead, Craig.
That's actually the problem. Is we can't just assert that those what?
Sorry, I thought you were cutting out for a second, but it seemed like you're okay. Can you hear me? Yeah, you were coming in for a second there.
Can you hear me?
Now we can't hear you at all.
I can hear.
Yeah, now we can.
Can't.
You're good.
Can hear me or can't?
Yes.
Can't.
Yes.
Okay, so the problem with the argument is that it presupposes God, and we can't just assert that the laws of logic depend on the God as we have to prove that to the atheist. That's the problem with the argument. I think it can be done. Maybe. I do want to get to before we get too into this. Tell me about the stream with Scholar Fiction, because I really liked your argument there. And then you said you borrowed it from.
Yeah, well, I can get into that. Yeah, I've done a few streams. Sorry, Craig, you're breaking up a little bit. Okay, well, I'll just talk about that. Yeah, I've done it. Now I can hear you. Okay. Yeah, I've done a few streams on the problem of evil.
I'm not talking. You can.
Oh, okay. Okay. So I've done a few streams on the. I've done a few streams on the problem of evil, and the original one was with Skylar, and that was actually my first YouTube stream at all. And But yeah, it's pretty much been the same argument each time. But my one with Ben Watkins a few weeks ago is my more recent one, so I would recommend somebody check that one out.
The one that I moderated.
Yeah.
On a Converse Contenders channel. Yeah, that was a good debate.
Yeah.
I
enjoyed that.
I haven't seen that yet. Okay, so.
Okay, but yeah, with Skylar though, it took more of a route. He likes to more get into biblical content. So Ben Watkins, it was purely, natural theology. But with Skylar, we focused more on the Bible. But yeah, basically it's this theodicy. It's kind of a version of Thomas Ord's, but I've also drawn upon different ideas. I don't totally agree with Ord, but I think he's going in the right direction on some things. So just to distinguish my version from Ord. So Ord argues that God, it's this idea, it's called essential kenosis. So it's this idea that God is limited in his attributes, and basically that God is confined in how he works within the universe. And so Ord's most recent book is called God Can't. So he's saying God can't do certain things. And if he had a recent debate on Unbelievable like a few weeks ago, and that kind of lays out his position. And I think Ord makes a lot of valuable insights about the problem of evil, but his view, I think, goes too far in the direction of limiting God's power. And it ends up making difficult. Yeah, it ends up becoming difficult to reconcile this with a Christian eschatology. I mean, how is God going to bring about, a new heavens and new earth if he can't do certain things?
Yeah.
Well,
it becomes possible. That's the defect. It answers. When I listened to him in the debate, it answered a couple of questions and it gave you some cool insights. But there's a really big problem. Like if God can't do things, that's a really big problem. Actually, go ahead.
Can you
hear? Can you guys? I sometimes can't hear you.
Yeah. I can hear you, but it does go robot voice a little. But
yeah, you guys are going robot too. Damn, this is annoying. All right.
I think everybody on stream is able to hear him all right. Yeah. If you ever cut out, I'll be able to take over, Craig. Yeah. So how do you differentiate?
Good.
Yeah. So I just want to make one other point. So in Ord's book, The Uncontrolling Love of God, which is his main book where he lays out this idea, he also seems to argue that the laws of physics have a kind of metaphysical necessity to them, which does make his view make sense, but it makes more problems. But anyways, that's Ord's view. What I argue instead is I take a version of the free will defense, and this isn't totally my idea, but it kind of is the way I work with it. But anyways, take the free will defense but expand that to the natural world. So I argue that God can't justifiably, so it's not that he lacks the power, it's that it would conflict with his moral nature and his moral character to force beings into relation with him. And the only type of reality that beings would be in relation with God, like a perfect kind of relation, would be the heavenly universe. So that's the only type of reality where the laws of nature are perfectly conformed to God's will, because, let me rephrase that. The type of reality where everything's perfectly conformed to God's will is the type of reality where there's not going to be suffering. But the only type of reality where everything's perfectly conformed to God's will is the type of reality where every being is also in relation with God. But God can't justifiably force beings into a perfect relation with God. So God has to start beings out in a universe where things are not perfectly conformed to his will, and then that's going to open the door to there being imperfections and so on. I'm actually laying this out in kind of like a book essay form along with my argument for God, and I'm hoping to post that soon because it's hard to lay out all the steps in these streams and stuff, but hopefully it kind of makes sense. But
yeah,
anyways, that's the idea.
Okay, so why I like it. There's a lot of things about it that at first glance a lot of people might not realize how good it actually is. But when we're talking about, okay, let's just assume for argument's sake that we in the Christian community are correct, and there's a sovereign God who is omnipotent and omniscient, then the problem of evil isn't really a problem. It's just an intellectual quandary. Why does God allow evil? Yours is the first framing that actually makes sense of a lot of it. And it's almost in other words, there would be a right answer. And yours is the closest I've ever heard to the actual right answer. Because heaven, there is no suffering, there is no sin, there is no sorrow, there is no death. But you have chosen to be there. And when you are there, God is in control. It's God's kingdom. And this world is not God's kingdom. We are in control. So there's a lot of it that makes sense. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go.
Oh, it's fine. Yeah, I think that it does make a lot of sense. And again, I don't take full credit for it. It's the problem of evil is something that I've wrestled with for a long time, because I always thought the free will argument, I know that there's some who push back on the free will argument, but to me, that always made a lot of sense to explain moral evil, but it didn't really explain natural evil very well. And actually, it doesn't totally explain moral evil very well, but for technical reasons, which we can maybe get into. But basically, there needs to be a new type of argument. And, so reading Ord, I had a priest who made some comments and some homilies that kind of sparked these ideas. And I thought more about this, like maybe this can be reconstructed. And actually what's interesting is that debate on Unbelievable that Ord had with, I think the guy's name was Peckham.
Yeah,
I haven't read his book, but, Greg Boyd and some others argue along that line, arguing for the angelic rebellion view, that it's the fallen angels that cause natural evil. And for a little while, I defended that view, and I thought that was the best thing going. But then I realized there actually are some serious reasons to challenge that theodicy that they didn't get into in Unbelievable, but they kind of touched on it. But then I moved more towards
he was great in that, because the host asked him, he's like, it makes sense what you're saying, but I can already see the pushback, and atheist is going to say, like, isn't this just like fairy tales and stories? Like, demons, right?
It's worse than that. Yeah, it's even worse than that, because Ord, as Ord capitalized on it, ultimately just raises the problem. Why would God set things up that way? And I don't see a good way around. I know Peckham did a good job defending it. Like, I think he defended it the best that you can, but ultimately it's going to face, and it's not to say it's definitively false, but it has a lot of problems. So that kind of pushed me more towards thinking, we need to come up with a more simple hypothesis that actually captures on intuitions a little bit better. So yeah, I agree with you that the initial reaction that somebody, and I think some were reacting, like when I was talking to Skylar, I think he gave me that pushback, is like, well, you're making God powerless, and that would solve the problem, but now God's powerless. But the thing is, as you, I think, recognize, the argument doesn't take away God's power. It's saying God's power respects his moral character, which is exactly what Christianity and the Bible have always argued. God can't lie. God can't will injustice. And I'm just saying we can expand that to a few more details. And who knows, maybe that's how things work. So
right. Well, that's why I like the argument, because there's a part where atheists go dumb when they're thinking about God. There are the one thing that the Bible makes perfectly crystal clear, which you get, is that God cannot act in a way inconsistent with himself. So if God is likened to light, he can't just decide to be dark for a little bit. So he's got to have round the boards. This is hard to explain just off the top of my head, but you kind of get something essential about theology that most people miss. That God operates within certain limits because of who he is. He can't be otherwise. And that doesn't actually create all these dilemmas that atheists thinks it creates. In other words, light can't, act differently in this particular situation. It has to do what light does. God is sort of the same way. And your version gets that. I don't know if did that make sense? I think it made sense. Go ahead.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and that's what Ord gets too. It's just that Ord goes too far in the direction of that God is actually not just morally limited, but God's actually physically limited. So
right.
God is theodicy, and it just goes too far. Like, I respect what Ord's trying to do, but yeah, it goes too far. So I think that my approach is a better middle ground. I do want to talk about, though, one other theodicy that I think has some merit, if you want to get into that, or we can go back to
go for it.
Sure.
Whatever you want to say.
Okay. Yeah, I just finished reading Trent Doherty's book, which is very expensive, but it's called The Problem of Animal Pain. And Cameron Bertuzzi on Capturing Christianity was big on this book, and that's how I stumbled across it. But anyways, so the soul building theodicy is a popular theodicy, maybe the most popular, I don't know, that gets championed. And it has it sounds somewhat plausible at first, but then it has some major problems. But the way that Doherty presents it is actually, I think, the best version. So that would be my next go-to theodicy. So if somebody's interested in that, because he doesn't argue, like going back to, you mentioned Voltaire earlier. So like one of the problems that people raise with soul building type theodicies is you think, well, like every event in somebody's life has some, God has planned for. If somebody's going to argue that type of view, that just seems like morally offensive. The idea, a tragedy occurs, to think that God planned that all along. And I know Calvinists will tend to argue that way, but that's going to strike most people, especially non-Christians, as just offensive. But so that assumes an idea that Doherty points out called meticulous providence. So the idea that every event needs to manifest in some particular good that comes from it. Like, this car accident happened or whatever it might be, and that was so this person would learn this or something. And it's like, come on, like, yeah, that somebody can make a movie about something like that, but does that really seem like a morally plausible way to argue? But what Doherty argues is rather that God has created the type of world that there is going to allow for certain virtues to manifest. So there is going to be some gratuitous suffering, but this type of world is still going to manifest certain virtues. Now, again, I'm not as big on that theodicy, but I think it's the best way that one can argue for soul building. And then he also extends it to animals, and then he also argues that animals are going to go to heaven and then gain intelligence, and that's where it gets. What
did you say when you were presenting yours? Dr. Josh had a good objection that I thought was actually the best possible objection. And what
did I say was?
What was his objection was like, what happens to a 3-year-old who dies and goes to heaven?
Right. Yeah, and that's right. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Right. Dr. Josh should raise that problem. What about, a young person who dies? And that's the major problem, I think, or one of the major problems with the free will defense, because some versions of the free will, theodicy or defense are going to argue, well, God's placed us here so that we can make a decision if we want to follow him or not. And that totally is plausible. I mean, I think that that's true, but it's true in some sense. But what about infants who die? What about, babies in the womb who die and so on? When did they get a decision time? And that seems like it could cut against my theodicy as well. I don't think it does, because I think that it's more that you need the stage, the pre-heavenly stage. So God needs to give you that sort of chance. I don't think it's actually about exercising a choice. It's just that God can't force you into a relation to start with. But I think that Dr. Josh's objection is probably the best initial objection that one could make.
I thought so. So let's see if we do we get your argument? You're saying that, as I understand it, tell me if I'm wrong, that this world as it functions, there are laws in operation in this world, but this isn't the perfect world as God intended it, as is in heaven. And part of why we are here first, and we don't go directly in heaven, is that would be somewhat coercive and in a way unfair, because in order for us to live in concert with the perfect world that as God intended it, there has to be some sort of, am I getting this right? Tell me if this sounds right. Am I framing this correctly?
Yeah.
In order for a choice to be made, there has to be the option there. And if somebody was like automatically existing inside of heaven, they would like have supreme knowledge of what the good is, and so they wouldn't have the option in that at that point in time to actually choose not being in heaven. Or maybe I'm mistaking it somewhere.
You're right on the part of it. I then expand it more to, because I mean that sounds more just like a version of the free will defense, which is a springboard for this argument.
Mm-hmm.
But with this, I'm arguing that it expands towards the law-like regularities as well to explain natural evil too. So it's that the laws of the universe can't God can't force them to conform to his will perfectly, because only a reality that where everything conforms to God's will would also
has perfect laws in accordance with
right.
I get it.
Right. Yeah, I think
it's smart. It's really smart. Yeah. It's actually really smart. It solves a lot of I don't know. It's very close to like I like. Do you see why I like it, John, or what? Am I
No.
Yeah, am I overrating it? Am I overrating the dry apologist here?
I don't think I fully understood it when you were laying it out in your discussion with Ben Watkins, just because I was kind of working through moderation. But now, having heard it a couple times now, it does make more sense, and I do think it probably does have more weight to it than the free will argument. Because like one of the problems I sort of have with the free will defense or theodicy is the fact of animal suffering. And so animal suffering, like, okay, what's the purpose of animals if they don't have souls that are going to be able to like be in a relationship with God or something like that? But your argument sort of includes, I guess, animals in the picture somewhat.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a fallen world in his argument. It's a fallen world. We live in the world not as God intended it. And when we get to heaven, it's the perfect world. So all the laws will function properly and perfectly too. But right now we live in the fallen world, and that fallen world affects everything. It actually does incorporate the fall and sin and theology. That's why I kind of like it too.
Right.
It frames better with classical Christian theology than most people would realize at first glance. Like you're not as much of a like avant-garde Christian as people might think.
Because some of the people were posting after Skylar's discussion. I don't even read comments on stuff anymore because I'm just so discouraged with some of the stuff people say. But some people were like, "Oh, well, I kind of like where you're coming from, but it's not really biblical and stuff." And I was just kind of like, "Well, you're not really. Maybe you need to give me more of a chance." But yeah, in regards to animal suffering, so yeah, I mean, I don't think that there's any problem with a Christian arguing that animals have an afterlife. So like Trent Doherty, David Bentley Hart, there's actually some really traditional, like even Martin Luther, John Calvin even had this kind of idea going on that a lot of people don't realize. It's actually not out of line with Christian theology, just the Bible doesn't talk about that. And that's a whole nother question or issue, why and so on. But I don't have a problem with animals having an afterlife. I don't think they have free will, so to speak. But yeah, I would say that God would respect their autonomy as well, or that they would serve this kind of purpose here. They're part of the law-like system as well with evolution and so on, that, God would create them as part of our world as well, even though they're on a journey to heaven as well. Now, I don't think they sin, so I don't think it's that they are atoned for, so to speak. But even with the atonement, you have a cosmic atonement that Christ atones for the disorder within the world is also a traditional idea. So basically, and that's kind of what I'm trying to do, is I think apologists kind of shoot themselves, and I'm not saying I'm like the expert or something, but I really think that Christians need to start expanding their arguments, because a lot of the stuff that you hear that gets repeated doesn't totally work. And I sympathize with where a lot of atheists are coming from in their objections. So some of the
most of the atheist objections are right. That's
right.
The problem, is you can't just disregard. I mean, they're baby eaters and they're evil, and I believe that as much as the next guy. But when they object to the substance of the argument, 99 times out of 100, the objections are usually valid. And you have to then take that into consideration and, adjust accordingly. You can't just go, oh, they just, you know what I'm saying?
Exactly. Yeah. No, I totally, like when I got into apologetics and things, I would listen to people like Christopher Hitchens, and I'm like, I don't like his conclusion, but he's making valid points, and I'm just hearing weak arguments in response. And then, yeah, and it was, anyways, yeah, I agree. I mean, I think a lot of the atheist objections, like, I mean, I think a lot of the stuff they say about the Bible is correct. I think we need to reinterpret how we view inspiration and such. And it's not that I seek out these conclusions to like be a liberal or something. It's that I think if Christianity is true, we really got to follow the evidence where it leads. Otherwise, why aren't we just young earth creationists? You know, it's like we got to actually look at the evidence.
Well, we have to engage with it in a real and meaningful way, to satisfy the intellectual objections too. We can't, you know, we have to kind of listen to them to a certain degree and incorporate what they're saying into how we are moving forward. You know,
right. Well, yeah, and the same type of objections were raised by Christians centuries ago. If you look at people like Gregory of Nyssa or Origen, they had these same kinds of concerns that atheists raise today. Unfortunately, some of their ideas, whether it's right or wrong, didn't catch on with the tradition. Now, I'm all, being a Catholic, I'm all for tradition when it comes to capital T traditions, but there's some traditions, some ideas that maybe have gotten lost within the history of Christian thought that we need to kind of revitalize, because the early Christians actually were proposing some of these types of things, and it kind of got lost. And now we're kind of paying the price, I think, because medieval and Reformation theology won the day. And not to say, again, when we're talking about major doctrines like the Trinity and so on, yeah, I totally agree. I'm talking more about some of these peripheral things about God's justice and such. You know, Christianity took this kind of voluntarist route that God is the sovereign, which he is, but that thereby entails that he can just do whatever he wants with creation, and we just submit to whatever, you know, exactly what it says in these Old Testament stories and so on. And it's like, we're now paying the price intellectually.
Well, one, I guess, sort of question I had regarding your theodicy is, it seems to, I mean, you don't have to take Genesis like historically or literal in that sense. It could have like theological significance, but even then I would think it would somewhat come in somewhat contradiction with your theodicy, because like it seems to indicate that within the theological tradition there was a time in which or like it is the case that God could create man and a woman in a state of harmony with nature and with God. And in that position, they chose to go against that.
Yeah. So, yeah, I would argue that Adam and Eve, again, just treating the story theologically, that they weren't in perfect relation with God. You know, I would say like nobody on earth is in perfect relation with God, but we have some kind of relation with God. We're not totally detached from God, but I would say they were in an indirect relation with God. So maybe after the fall, they were in less of a relation, but it wasn't a perfectly harmonized relation. And that's a metaphysical thesis. You wouldn't get that per se from reading the story, but it makes sense in light of, people that are even within the biblical picture, those in, the new heavens and the new earth, I think we would have to argue are in a closer relation than Adam and Eve were. So there is a degree of relationship.
Sure. And you could probably also argue that like for Adam and Eve, at least from some readings of the text, you can kind of see that they're in a state of ignorance, I guess, to what like sin is and what evil is. And even like what, like they had no shame. They had an almost maybe childlike vision of reality. And it was only through the fall do the scales fall from their eyes, and do they kind of sort of realize how their actions affect reality, and like what are the repercussions for their own actions, that I guess they didn't have a perfect harmony with God, and because there was certain I guess components to reality that they couldn't even understand from their own position.
Yeah, I mean, I interpret the Adam and Eve story very loosely. I think it's largely parabolical, which I think is an important route to take, but I think it's another issue. But yeah, like someone like, Craig, I'd mentioned in my discussion with Skylar that, William Dembski was a name I mentioned, and he argues and the end of Christianity that, you know, we get this sort of evolutionary history of pain, because oftentimes it gets raised, like, you know, young earth creationists will raise, like, you know, why was there, if death is the result of sin, then what about animal death, you know, before Adam and Eve and so on, or if there are other humans before Adam and Eve? And again, that's a separate issue, but why was there death? And Dembski argues, well, it was retroactive, that God brought about this death because he saw what they were going to do. And to me, that actually is a really somewhat plausible way to reconcile it, but it then just raises the question of why would God respond that way? So I agree with Craig that, you know, the perspective I'm offering, I think, is a way to incorporate the fall in a way that I think is more plausible, that it's not viewed as a punishment. Rather, the fall is just a metaphysical necessity given our relation with God.
It's the human condition, and it's the condition of the natural world. And it's the thing about your view that's interesting is it has more scriptural justification than most people would realize. Because, like, even in Romans, it talks about, you know, in creation itself groans in anticipation for the day when the sons of God will be revealed. In other words, that the mission of the church is to reconcile God's nature with the actual fallen condition of the world itself. So your view isn't that avant-garde and unbiblical, actually. It lines up with some parts of the Bible really well. That's why I was, wait a minute, this is more interesting. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, yeah, I think it fits really well with Romans 8. You know, all of creation is groaning.
Thank you. Yes, it's exactly, yes,
right.
Exactly.
And that was what I raised to Skylar as well. And there was another verse that I drew upon, which maybe is a little bit more debatable, but yeah, that I think it fits fine with the biblical perspective. A lot of times people will latch on to one biblical verse to argue for this kind of soul building or whatever their theodicy might be. And they'll say, like, oh, well, in Genesis 50, it talks about Joseph, and it says, Joseph says, God, you know, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And it's like, sure, you can use that verse to argue for some other theodicy, but, like, to me, that's a pretty, like, weak scriptural verse. So it's like, you know, there's another guy, Bruce Little, who he really goes through these verses, and it's like, you know, these verses don't add up to supporting this perspective. But anyways, yeah. I think
so. How liberal of a Christian are you? Are you unorthodox? Are you kind of orthodox? Are you orthodox for Catholic? What's your deal?
No, I would say I'm totally orthodox. And, you know, the traditional Catholic said I hold perspectives that some people would say, like, this type of perspective, they might say, well, that sounds liberal, but I think that they're just mistaken on what liberal means.
Right,
I mean,
but you don't vote for Democrats, though.
Well, I'm a pro-life voter, so I'm going to vote, you know, the party that's going to be pro-life. So, but yeah, I hold totally conservative, traditional perspectives. But when it comes to some of these things, like, I think we do need to reevaluate the nature of, like, biblical inspiration. Some people would say that sounds liberal. I would say they're just mistaken and not grappling with a reasonable perspective of God. So somebody can call that whatever they want, but I would just say that it's just being reasonable. So,
right. Well, that's the part that Skylar even responded to, because he was pretty good with you in the sense that he kind of liked you, because you didn't condemn everybody to hell, and he kind of got you a little bit, I thought, and Dr. Josh too. I thought that conversation was good. It's better than most of the ones where people are trying to argue.
Yeah, and I really appreciated them having me on, because, again, that was the first stream I had done, and I'd reached out to Skylar to see if we could set something up. So yeah, I was really appreciative of how that whole thing went. But, yeah.
John, are there questions?
Not yet. I can put it in the chat, or if anybody wants to, they can put in any questions. I had a couple questions just going through this. For your I don't know, what do you kind of call it? The relationship theodicy or free relationship?
I call it the theodicy. I argue I call it perfect will theodicy.
Perfect will. Okay. Yeah. There's something in that sort of reminded me of Ben Watkins' like second argument of divine hiddenness. Like the first premise of that is something like, if a God exists, then he would anyone that was open and willing to be in a relationship with him would be in such a relationship. And then the second premise is like, there are people open and willing to be in a relationship with him. And you didn't. So, and I don't know, from your theodicy, it's almost seems like there's a similarity there. I don't know if they can be a direct matchup with each other, but that if a good God exists, it would not force people into a relationship with him.
Yeah, I mean, this theodicy works just as well with the hiddenness, and that's what I think that Ben and I agreed, that the hiddenness can be a subset of natural evil. So yeah, I think if a theodicy works for natural evil, then it works for hiddenness as well, and especially with this, there's a relation. So yeah, I think it works for the problem of hiddenness too.
So it could be there are limitations to the world in which we exist within, where we can't just go into a relationship with God, even if we freely will to do so at this present moment in time.
Right. So the hiddenness argument oftentimes gets misunderstood, because sometimes people think it's saying like, well, why isn't God's existence more obvious? And a Christian will say, well, it is obvious. Have you read this book, or have you heard this argument?
Haven't you read C.S. Lewis? It's totally obvious.
Right. And the thing is, even if there's a perfect proof for God out there, that actually doesn't touch upon the hiddenness argument, because all that the hiddenness argument is saying is, at some moment in time, there has been somebody who wanted to be in relation with God, but wasn't able to because it wasn't obvious enough, even if it is obvious for some people. And to me, that's a legitimate, moral argument against the existence of God. But the way that I would use my theodicy to respond to that is to say, well, yeah, God's existence should be more evident for everybody, but we live, as Craig was saying, we live in this imperfect world where things don't manifest God as clearly as they should. So I agree with the logic of the hiddenness objection. It does seem like God would make his existence more evident to everybody. At least there could be more to it, of course.
And also, why your argument has some good attributes too, is that it puts responsibility squarely on the church. The church is supposed to be living out the perfect will of God in concert with God's will. And we were supposed to have created a much better church over the last 2,000 years, where God's presence would be a lot more obvious to a lot more people. So that argument wouldn't hold as much water. So there's some responsibility for how history has played out squarely in the hands of human agency that God allowed, but it wasn't God's fault per se. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I don't know, so far I guess my default theodicy has been sort of the free will theodicy, and even sort of extrapolating that outwards onto creatures as well, because I don't know, it seems like almost arbitrary to make a classification between humans that just because they have speech or rational abilities, that's what gives them free will. I mean, there's other creatures that sort of act in a way that's, I guess it depends really on your definition of free will. If by free will we just mean they act according towards their nature, whatever they're inclined towards, that could be a way in which you could say that animals also have free will. So the free will theodicy, I think, or actually, sorry, the soul building theodicy, that's what I wanted to get into, was the meticulous providence. It doesn't really make sense according to God's nature, because he's setting up all these things that are just going to make it so that they'll be good in the end. But I think that it could instead be taken that despite how humans use their free will to act evilly towards one another, God has created the souls of the people such that they'd be able to be built up from those sorts of interactions. It's not saying that God's the one that's causing these things to happen, but rather that God's, I guess, affecting the outcomes so that they'll at least be like the verse from about Joseph, what's intended for evil, God turned over for good. So what's your main objection to that?
Yeah, I think the soul building theodicy becomes a lot more plausible, or can be more plausibly defended if you don't also assign or attach meticulous providence to it. But
right, so like maybe Calvinism would have that.
A lot of times Christian, and this is the thing, a lot of Christians who are well-meaning assign these extra philosophical doctrines to Christianity that don't actually need to be there. Things like divine command theory and meticulous providence, and the list goes on. Things that actually aren't a part of
Wait, what is meticulous providence exactly?
These things aren't actually a part of any creed. They aren't actually taught in the Bible per se.
But they're things that have been tacked on to how people perceive Christianity.
And then people, especially when you're arguing with a lot of atheists who maybe aren't out there studying in-depth philosophy and things, no fault to them, but just most people aren't, assume, well, that's the Christian worldview. And it's like, no, that's an interpretation and a certain apologetic that a lot of Christians have adopted. But like young earth creationism, for example, very recent phenomenon. There have been some Christians who have argued it, but it's not a tenet of Christianity. But anyways, that's a side thing. So meticulous providence would be the view that every event is planned by God, whether we have free will or not. I mean, somebody can hold free will or not and still hold the meticulous providence. So every event is planned by God to manifest, or even if it's not planned, every event is needed to manifest some particular good attached to that event. So like we might say, like Jesus's death on the cross, that achieved a direct good. Well, that would be an example. And a lot of times Christians will cite that as an example. Sure, that's an example, but they'll use that.
Oh, there's no such thing as like, oh, I got you. So, yeah, so there's no such thing as just, well, that just sucked. No, that just sucked. There's no good, nothing good can just suck. Deal with it.
Right, exactly. And the problem is not only is that one, implausible, it just doesn't seem the way the world works, but two, it makes God the author of evil. Ultimately, it seems like it makes God the author of evil, and that's what Bruce Little and others have argued, and David Bentley Hart.
Well, that's also what happens. Like that's what I've talked about with Schuyler. Brings that up a lot with his problem of evil arguments, is that he always points to things that at least theoretically seem to have no redemptive purpose whatsoever. Like here's a little girl who was locked in a closet for the first 14 years. Like that's what he points to as like evidence against God, that there's this thing that happened that seemed to have no redemptive purpose at all. It was just, terrible and dismal, and you can't imagine why God would allow it. And what you're saying is that standard Christian theological argument against that is kind of defensive. Like, no, it definitely had a good reason, and God's good reason. Is that exactly. Kind of
right? And not only is that implausible, and it's morally
dubious.
Well, it's morally problematic. At least it seems like it is. But also, it leads to it can lead to psychological problems for Christians, because they're thinking, well, hey, this bad event happened. When's this greater good going to come from it? Where they're looking for the meticulous providence, and this can actually cause serious psychological ramifications.
Okay, so here's something in support of your argument that I've thought about in the past. I'm not sure if I'm going to say this correctly, but when I became a Christian, I quit smoking, right? When you smoke, you are harming your lungs. That's something that is occurring every single time you smoke the cigarettes. And I knew that for forever, 10 years, I smoked 2.5, 3 packs of cigarettes a day. That damage was done. I became a Christian, I stopped smoking. That doesn't necessarily automatically erase all of the negative consequences of the choices I had made prior. Those might have been law. It's like disease is a law that's put into effect. And once it's in operation, maybe God could sovereignly stop it, but why? It's part of how things are. It's a fallen world. You smoked, you harmed your lungs. You became a Christian, now you don't smoke. That harm is still there, and it was still done. So you reap the consequences. Does that...
Well, yeah, and of course you could imagine a meticulous providence defender is going to say, yeah, but all those years of smoking, it was to lead up to there's going to be some moment where you're going to witness to a smoker and you're going to be able to turn them around. They'll tell you a story of how the meticulous providence might work. And you can come up with stories, but it comes implausible because
and it makes you sound dumb, ultimately.
There's some situations like the ones that Schuyler likes to focus on that, it becomes very difficult to apply that to them, even if it's and it's totally theoretical that if we don't find the empirical evidence for it, it starts to undercut it too.
Well, makes us look like idiots because he'll come up with a weird example, and then you try and circle his square, and you start grasping at straws to circle his square. Okay, well, this is why that's redemptive, and you start to sound like an idiot. And actually, this even works on the ground floor, because I remember when I first became a Christian, we went to a restaurant with some of the Christians who I was hanging out with. And like the waitress came up and somebody said something to her, and she goes away, and one of them was like, maybe that's why we were sent here. And I was like, oh God, come on, man.
And it could be. It could
yeah,
be
but it's like
some events. But yeah, the idea though that every event has to work like that, it's just so implausible, and it's not required. I mean, we could go to heaven and God could reveal that everything was meticulously planned for, but we shouldn't be employing implausible things to try to evangelize to people, right? And requiring them to accept these add-ons that aren't even part of the Christian message. They're just philosophical theories.
right. And we should also incorporate, to the best of our ability, basic common sense and basic reality, where you can own that some things, maybe even to the point where you're like, I'm not exactly sure why that could have happened. You know what I mean? Like
right.
That's also what I liked, is that you were bringing more like common sense, how things work in the real world into at least when you think about these theological problems. You can't just disregard how things actually are. You got to kind of circle the square and reconcile the heady theology with the actual real world to some degree. And that's where the reconciliation needs to take place. John, did you want to ask more questions?
Yeah, I can go into your contingents.
Well, can I just add one more thing if we're going to change topics? So I don't know if you guys watched the debate, and I don't want to harp on any particular person or anything, but there was that debate right before I did that debate or discussion with Skylar. Skylar was on Modern Day Debate and debated Trent Doherty, the guy I just mentioned, who wrote, I think, one of the best books I've read on the problem of evil.
Right.
And it was one of the weirdest debates. I don't know if you guys have watched it.
Yes, it was a terrible debate.
Trent Doherty is a critic of what's called skeptical theism, which is really just the academic type of appeal to mystery. So like, well, we can't know God's ways, and I have a problem with skeptical theism. But Trent Doherty is a critic of skeptical theism, and for most of that debate, he defended skeptical theism and forced Skylar to try to refute skeptical theism. At least that was what I took away. It was totally odd. Here's a major academic who is one of the biggest critics of skeptical theism in a debate with somebody on the problem of evil, and seems, at least to me, to defend skeptical theism. And I don't know if he was doing this to try to challenge Skylar, or he didn't think Skylar would fully grasp his soul-building theodicy, but it was totally
I
odd.
think that Skylar Fiction is sometimes a really surprisingly good debater, and he's really good at pinning people. And I think what happens with a lot of Christians is you can have a lot of ideas about stuff, but when you actually try to defend it with someone who's trying to debunk, dismiss, and discredit it, you get trapped. And you start going, oh, wait a minute. And then you start just trying to, say whatever to kind of get. I think he was just kind of, the debate was hard for him, and he was struggling, because he struck me as much brighter than he was in that debate in general. Like, you have to be kind of good at intellectual maneuvering.
You're talking about Trent Doherty?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, but I mean, his whole approach, though, starting out, it seemed to me like he was just going the skeptical theist route, and he kind of touched on some of his soul-building ideas, but that wasn't his main thrust. He was like asking Skylar to give him a deductive, valid argument, which was fair enough. But I don't know. I was just wondering, because I didn't talk to anybody about that.
Watch my video on that, because I made a video about that a long time ago. Go check that out.
I think I might have watched it, but okay.
Yeah, it's surprising because like Trent Doherty, he's usually quite good in like his debate with Tom Jump on Cameron Bertuzzi's channel was quite good, and he was like fully on top of things there. I think it was probably because of early on the Skylar debate, like they hit a nerve, and then like both were kind of like digging in their heels, not wanting to like express any sort of charitability towards the other person.
It was a terrible debate.
Well,
And I remember that he kept going, make a syllogism, make a syllogism. This guy was like, no, shut up. And it's like, yeah, it was a really bad debate.
well, the other thing, one of the reasons why I think Trent, and I'm not getting into like talking about particular people, but reason why the person who has the positive case in a debate has the harder time. So a lot of times that's why atheists come across, in my opinion, looking better in debates, because they say, what's your job to convince me? Which, yeah, I mean, I agree that the theist has the burden of proof. Now, with the problem of evil, Schuyler actually does have the burden of proof, but it can sometimes come across like the theist does. But anyways, I've just noticed any debate you're watching, the person who has the burden of proof is going to come across, they have an uphill battle. And that's
right,
where
totally.
atheists, on average, come across looking better in debates, because they usually take the weak atheist position. And because if they're going to take like the problem of evil, it's hard to argue against the problem of evil.
Well, that's what I tried to point out in the debate, in my YouTube videos about these. That's one of the biggest philosophical conundrums of the path, of life itself. The greatest minds have grappled with, not come up for answers. The idea that you're going to plausibly answer that in a way that's convincing in a YouTube video, a YouTube debate, it's like, Socrates struggled with it, freaking Nietzsche's trying, I'm gonna solve it in this YouTube video. It's a little bit absurd. And that's,
but I don't know. I give more credit to the people. Like when I'm watching modern day debate, I'm expecting somebody to come out with the top argument. Like I know a lot of people probably watch it for entertainment purposes, and that's what you see in a lot of the comments and such. But I respect the people on there, and I expect that they're going to come out with their. And I mean, I understand what you're saying, Craig, that it's unlikely somebody's going to have the end all argument. But I think a lot of people come to those debates thinking it's just pure entertainment and things, and I've gotten that. But like, I disagree. I don't watch it I mean, I do think it's entertaining, but I just push back when people have, I'm not saying you have that attitude, but when people have that attitude, I just don't like
it. Do you think it might have been like if Trent Doherty was suspecting like Schuyler was making some sort of like logical problem of evil thing, and so like all that would be necessary for him to refute it is present one possible alternative?
Here's the thing. Trent Doherty rejects that distinction between the logical and evidential problem. I mean, he thinks that they're basically the same problem. I agree with him. I don't think there's that big of a difference. But in reading his book, he actually doesn't make, I think he wanted to challenge Schuyler to say like, look, can you go over this low hurdle of skeptical theism? And he wanted to see if Schuyler could get over that lower, what he views as a lower hurdle. I think that was his strategy, but who knows?
Well, isn't the logical problem of evil trying to like point out a contradiction within the nature of God being omnibenevolent and omnipowerful? And isn't the evidential argument like something to do with like that there are these particular evils that we have evidence for, and we can see that if a God existed, these wouldn't exist? I don't know, maybe
that's usually how it's framed. That's Schuyler's framing of it.
Well, the evidential, so the logical problem of evil attempts to say that deductively, just sort of analytically, or at least nearly that, follows that God can't exist if there's evil. But the evidential says, well, sure, maybe it's logically possible, but it's highly unlikely, especially when we focus on particular examples of suffering. And the thing is, though, that Trent Doherty argues that basically they're not that much different, because if somebody can give a really good evidential version, that's basically a logical version as well. And I agree with Trent Doherty. If you can give a really strong evidential, that's pretty much the same as giving a logical. So, and since Trent Doherty's arguing based on probability already, if you watch like his discussion with T-Jump, that makes sense. Trent Doherty's not looking for airtight deductive proofs. He's saying argue what's most probable. So he doesn't make a big deal about that distinction between the logical and evidential arguments, at least when he wrote that book. So
yeah,
and that was also years ago.
Yeah, that's the thing, is like once you get these two sort of personalities together, and if there's already some sort of contention between the two, that there's not going to be charitable interactions with each other. And so it's hard to really get productive conversations to take place.
Yeah. And once what I pointed out, once a debate degenerates into the nanny poo phase, all bets are off.
Yeah.
Because even with my wife, once we reach that threshold where we're just talking stupid, it's really hard to get it back to constructive, because you just start, something shifts, and all of a sudden you're just not doing the same thing. You're being as unproductive as humanly possible, and you're playing games, and it degenerated into a place where it couldn't be brought back to positive dialogue. That's what I saw happening. So, did you want to ask him more questions, John? Did you have more stuff?
I just had a couple more questions on the contingency argument. Is that what you're referring to it as? Because I know there's kind of a difference.
Yeah, I quit calling it the contingency argument because it's in that vein. But somebody pointed out, if I'm willing to grant, it's called modal collapse, then it's technically no longer a contingency argument. So I don't really care about that. So I don't call it that anymore. And it's its own thing anyway. So I call it now like necessary foundation or necessary framework argument. And that's what I call it now. It's a version of the Leibnizian type rationalist proof, but yeah, I just call it something else now.
Right. I was thinking since it's like, I don't know, you could call it the dependency argument because it's still like
that is an argument, but
it is.
mine's a little bit different than that. So I don't want to call it that. But.
Gotcha. There's the premise in it that I've heard you defend, but I don't know. It seems like everybody's always objecting to the first premise, and instead of the more actually interesting one, that like if something has limitations, then that's an indication that the thing itself is contingent or dependent upon something else. Like, which is where you get the conclusion that absolutely necessary must not have any sort of limitations to it. Can you maybe give an example of because I'm having a hard time seeing the connection between having limitations and then that being dependent or contingent.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, there's a few things that we need to sort out, and the difficulty with sorting this argument out is that it's difficult in a debate and in dialogue and such, which is why I'm writing it out, and I'm hoping that helps. And I tried to do that with some of my YouTube videos, but that was really limited in constraints.
Do you have a place that you post your writing so that people can kind of see the arguments?
But I will. I'm gonna publish something, just self-publish so that people can, if anybody's interested, they can see it. But anyways, and I'll do that soon because I want to have it mapped out. Mm-hmm. But yeah, there's a few different issues at play. So one, it's the idea that so the word contingent can mean, and you see this get brought up in my debate with Alex Malpass, that he really wanted to hash that out. Contingent in everyday conversation tends to mean dependent, but in philosophical discourse, it means could have been otherwise. Now, could have been otherwise doesn't thereby mean dependent, otherwise you'd be begging the question. So when you're putting forth the traditional contingency argument, when somebody says that something's contingent, they mean could have been otherwise. And then the next step is to argue things that could have been otherwise are also dependent, but you have to argue for that. Okay. So when I'm saying that something is contingent, I'm not thereby also saying that it's thereby caused. That's the next part of the argument. Okay.
Right. So there's kind of the distinction there, because you can say it could have been otherwise or could not have been otherwise in terms of events. Determinists will argue that all events that occur could not have been otherwise. But you're saying in regards to things that actually exist, like my wallet here could have been otherwise, and that it could have not existed. And that's not referring to the event of me holding up the wallet, but actually the thing itself. Okay.
Right. Well, both, but yeah, determinists will argue that, yeah, events, at least our actions couldn't have been otherwise. But yeah, anything with limitations. So Josh Rasmussen and some others argue this point too, to some degree. So it's not just something that I've come up with, but it is a point that I've held to for a long time.
How good is Josh Rasmussen?
He's really good. He's really good. I highly recommend his book, How Reason Can Lead to God. I think that's one of the best books on natural theology. I don't agree with all of the points that he argues. One of the things that in every debate, so he's kind of like me, every debate he presents his arguments differently. So you can't just watch one of his debates and I'm not saying I'm as good as he is, but You can't just watch one of his debates and then totally know his method. You got to watch. What I would recommend is he had a discussion on capturing Christianity about a year ago or so with his name's Lance Hannestad, I think. I think that was when Josh Rasmussen came across the best. So if somebody
Okay, cool. I'll check that out.
Watch that one.
Yeah,
Some of his others.
He did a stream with Scott Clifton, I noticed.
Yeah, and it was not as focused. I really didn't get as much out of it. He presents it differently every time. But anyways, yeah, I would watch the one with Lance about a year ago on Capturing Christian. At least that was the one I liked. So yeah, this idea though that things that have limitations. So if you watch my discussion with Tom Jump on Modern Day Debate, he really pushed back on this, and I totally disagree with what he said. But so things that have limitations are contingent, because you can always ask, why is it limited in that way and not some other way? And there is no explanation for that other than to say it's caused, or at least that it's contingent, right? Because you could say, like, you know, somebody's 5 feet tall, but they could have been 6 feet tall. Those would be examples of limitations. But something that's infinite, there's only one way to be infinite, right? So if something's going to be necessary, meaning it could not have been otherwise, it's going to need to be unlimited, because there's only one way to be totally unlimited. But something that's limited, there's all kinds of different ways to be limited. So anything that's limited is thereby contingent, because we could say, well, why is it limited in this way and not that way, and so on, and go on forever. So if we're going to postulate what's going to be the most plausible option for a necessary thing, which again, the way necessary is getting defined is could not have been otherwise, it's got to be something that's totally unlimited. And this, again, this isn't an original point to me. It's not to say everybody agrees with this point, but there have been a number of philosophers who have assumed or argued for this point. The difficulty though is that people will point out that God has limitations. They'll say, well, God can't lie. God can't be a cracker. God can't be a square, you know, so on. You point out all these different things. You say, well, God's limited. And that's where I bring in this, and this is where it gets really tricky. I bring in another distinction where I say, where I'm talking about foundational limitations or fundamental limitations. Those are the kinds of limitations, because some kinds of limitations would be explained by necessity. For example, if a being is, or something is spaceless, by necessity, that thing cannot be material. So that explains why it would not be material. But if something is a foundational attribute, would be something that is exists at its most basic level of existence. It can't be limited at that very basic fundamental level of existence, like we're talking about its presence or its power, because those types of limitations could only be contingent. And again, I know that that's a lot to unpack, and I'm not saying you totally agree with me, but that's kind of how I'm going at it. And then again, that's not the full argument. I got to then unpack why contingent things need a cause and so on. So,
all right. So, like, if, like, say part of my, I don't know, nature of being a human, I have 2 arms and 2 legs. It would be sort of unreasonable to expect, like, okay, well, why couldn't I have 8 legs like a spider? But that would be sort of like a expectation for a different power, or a different, like, I have a certain limited number of legs because of who I am as a person. But for God, being a spaceless, materialist being, that sort of expectation of, like, okay, well, how come he doesn't have 8 legs, wouldn't match to the type of being that he is. Is that kind of like,
well, it's that for God, we can understand by necessity. If you say, why doesn't God have legs? We have a necessary explanation why God doesn't have legs. And again, we're not talking about Jesus. You know, of course, God incarnate has legs, but the divine nature. Why does the divine nature not have legs? Because it's a material. So that's a necessary connection. But if we say, why don't you have 4 legs? There is no necessary reason. It's a contingent fact, because we can imagine a possible world where you have 4 legs, but there is no possible world where God has legs. So that's kind of, I think that can help as well when you think about possible worlds.
Okay, so like I can't imagine a possible world in which 1 + 1 does not equal 2, but I can imagine a possible world in which, like, where I have 4 legs in it, and like due to, I guess, the limitation of the natures of 1 and 1, they cannot equal anything other than 2. But that same sort of like prerequisite is not the case for myself, like being a contingent being of material quality. I could be in these other sorts of ways.
Well, and it's not, so you use the word contingent. Yeah, you are contingent, but this is what establishes why you're contingent, right? So I wouldn't say it's because you're contingent, because somebody could say, well, you're begging the question. I would say, well, the fact that I can imagine other possible worlds in which you have different features is what makes you contingent. And if somebody says, yeah, but I could imagine God having different features in other possible worlds, I would say, no, you can't. And saying that, you're actually you must be misunderstanding what God is, because, and you can unpack that with them.
Right. Well, those are some of the standard ways that atheists get like dumb when they think of God, because they'll say a lot of things like that with not understanding. And then they'll I don't even want to vocalize what I'm about to go. I don't even want to go there.
No, I totally understand. Right. And there's a lot of really sharp atheists. So like, watch somebody like Ben Watkins. I mean, the people I've had on my channel, like they're really sharp thinkers. But
right, but they'll get really dumb in a couple of key areas.
Some of them,
like really dumb.
Some of them, but the thing is that a lot of the atheists, I've interacted with in social media like Facebook and so on, that a lot of times, yeah, they'll resort to arguments that I'm like, how could you have made that argument? Like, you're engaging in apologetic. And the thing is, there are Christians who do this too. I'm not just throwing. There are a lot of people who resort to bad arguments, I think, to win arguments, or they haven't thought it through. But there are really sharp people too. So it's like,
oh, I know. So yeah. Malpass is one of the sharpest people in town. I think that guy's brilliant. Let me ask you 2 questions. Epistemology. Do you know? You're pretty well versed in philosophy. Do you know epistemology too? Like
yeah, a little bit. I'm working through. I'm starting to really get into studying epistemology. It's something that I think is really important. I want to learn more about. So I know the basics, but yeah, I want to study that some more.
Okay, so you haven't really started doing.
I know the basics. I mean, I can get into it with you, but like I'm not an expert in it.
Okay, and what was the one thing I was going to ask you? I just forgot the second.
Was it
question.
About the contingency argument, or?
No, you can keep asking if you want. It was about. Oh! Did you watch the Matt Dillahunty? Did the
Tyler Vela?
No, he did watch that.
Okay.
Who did he just debate on Sunday? And they just posted it yesterday.
Oh, was it D'Souza?
Yeah, did you watch that yet?
I haven't watched that.
Oh, I didn't even know that happened.
Yeah, I saw it posted. I didn't watch it.
Yeah, I'll watch that. Okay, you can ask John. I
was actually going to ask him about the Tyler Vela's tag argument, because I know you're a fan of that as well, Craig. And the way that Tyler has been putting it forward, it seems quite plausible and reasonable to kind of reach the conclusion that he's sort of making there, I think, at least. And so it's something like the laws of logic are true in all possible worlds. The laws of logic will have to either like rely upon some sort of material basis so that they're about the things that it's referring to, or be contained within some sort of mind, like maybe they're like just mental constructs or something like that. But if there's certain possible worlds where there are no material things, and including material minds to be able to like hold these logical constructs, then there would be no sort of grounding for where these logical laws could exist in a sort of way, or be true, really. I don't know. It's sort of a weird rendition of it, but that's at least how I sort of understand Tyler Vela's point. But I know that you have a certain objection to it, or like you don't think it's like a full-on proof, I guess.
Are you asking me or him?
No, I was asking Dry, trying to get a better understanding of why you don't think that works.
Go for it, Dry. What's your interpretation of his argument, and why do you like it, and why do you hate it?
I think he got frozen.
Did he really?
Yeah, he hasn't blinked in like a full 30 seconds now.
No, he doesn't blink much. He's
I do see Spartan Theology got in the chat though. Hey Spartan.
What's up, Spartan? I think he's gone.
Yeah. I guess I just sort of blew him away with Tyler Villa's argument there. So
yeah, I think he got intimidated too, John. I was going to say, you don't want to scare him.
I can't handle this. Does he need I wonder if he even knows that he's gone. Should make sure that he's good.
Dry Apologist left the meeting. That's what it just said up top.
Yeah. Anyway, I mean, the way that I understand the argument seems pretty plausible. Like Tyler Villa argues that like for something to be true, like say A equals A, that's what's true. That's a true law of logic that is true in all possible worlds. Now, suppose there's a possible world where there is not anything that exists. Like there's no material like keys that actually exist to say keys equals keys. So there's nothing for A equals A to refer to even.
Right, but the law of logic is inviolate and still exists. And how is the question?
Yeah.
And the implied answer is there's some sort of perceiving agent of mind. It's very similar to the law of eternal truth. There's some sort of, go ahead, follow the logic.
Yeah. And I think like I've read Phaser's book where he argues that like propositions have to have a mind in order to exist. And I think there's a way in which we can say that the proposition has to have a mind, but the thing which makes the proposition true doesn't have to be grounded in a mind. So like I could say snow is white. And the proposition in my head is true, but the fact that snow exists and snow has a certain quality to it that makes people see it as white would be true. And so you could say the proposition snow is white is true, even if no people actually existed that could have rational thought. And so I think that's something that like I would think even those facts, like facts about propositions, would be contingent upon the reality where these facts actually are true. So like if you have a world where there's no snow at all, then the proposition that snow is white wouldn't be true because there's nothing to which
but the law of logic is the inviolate law. It doesn't depend on snow or white. It depends on A equals A. And A equals A is going to be true in all possible worlds and in the immaterial realm. Now, the argument is almost really good. That's my point. Is like that already starts you thinking theologically. How could something be true in all possible worlds, immaterial true, transcendentally true, without God? I mean, that's the only way I can express it. But there's a real argument there because you already see how like A equals A being inviolate and true in all possible worlds already sounds like something holy. I don't know. You know what I'm saying? There's almost a really good argument there.
Yeah, and I think there's another like component that I don't think Tyler ever really gets into, but the fact that like the similarity that laws of logic have to thoughts because they're about something. Like we have thoughts because like I'm thinking about my keys that are sitting in front of me. And so I'm having a thought about something else. And the laws of logic, if they're like referring to something else, so A equals A, keys equals keys, then the law of logic is about those keys, even though it's not, I mean.
Right, but they're also the predicate for reason. I mean, that's why atheists like them so much, because they're the predicate for all reasonable thought. And they also match up with that. Remember at the end of the Glenn Scribner interview where he started telling us how Christianity helped incubate science? That kind of ties into that too, because it's presupposing. That's why I like the presuppositionalist arguments. They're almost really good because science presupposes some rational order to the universe, some laws to be investigated that, like cause and effect, things like that.
Right. So science, but I don't know if I would qualify that as a presuppositional argument. I mean, it's certainly like almost like a predictive quality to Christianity that like, okay, we're going to predict because our world was created by a God, so different from the Greeks. We were created by God, so that's different from, say, naturalism. and also the laws are comprehensible because they're also created by God. That's kind of the three kind of key things that you need that are all there within the Christian worldview, and we can start to like get science off the ground.
Right. Well, but
and it's the fact that you sort of have these.
It's comprehensible. It's rational. It follows reason, and it's forever and always. There's a forever and always true quality to these laws that are transcendent. That's the part where science starts. Go ahead. What? Is he back?
Yeah. Welcome back, Caleb. We kind of got off.
Why did you? What did you get scared because of the questions that John was asking?
Yeah. No, the internet cut out. I had to change rooms.
Yeah. So. Sure it did.
We got Spartan Theology in the chat too. Yeah, Tyler Vela definitely is a presupposition. Well, does sort of a presuppositional argument, but that's different from Glenn Scrivener's argumentation. That
I know. I'm just seeing a parallel because of his.
Oh yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the relation between any of these tag type arguments have a relation with presuppositionalism, because my understanding is that presuppositionalism, that whole tag argument goes back to Kant, which has a relation with, and I don't know if Kant was drawing upon St. Augustine, but there was that St. Augustine came up with this original idea that you have these Platonic truths that are found within the mind of God, and presuppositionalism is working with that kind of idea, it seems.
Right.
So yeah, totally. There is a relation with them. But to me, the problem with this argument, as I said before, is that truths by necessity are just necessarily true, or necessary truths are. And it's just like there doesn't need to be any further grounding. It could be that they're derived from God's mind, but it also could be they're necessary truths.
Right. That's exactly what Matt's counter argument was, is that he doesn't know that they need to be justified in any sort of, they're just true. And the point of the argument, why it's not quite a good argument, is that objection is actually valid. You need to prove it to the atheist. This is why it requires God. That's exactly the point.
For like most propositions, though, the truth maker to them is some sort of like, I don't know, whatever the proposition is trying to like assert is actually true. So like by saying water is H2O, the fact that water is H2O makes that proposition true. But if the like, what is the truth maker to the laws of logic? I mean, if they're like going to be true no matter what, like, is it just A equals A doesn't have some sort of truth maker to it? Like it's just true independent of anything?
Yeah, necessities don't need truth makers. So that water is H2O, if that's a necessary truth, it doesn't need a truth maker either. It's only a contingency that needs something to ground it.
And so...
Well, the argument is that they do need a truth maker, but that needs to be proved.
Right, that's the argument, but I'm saying that's the problem with the argument, is it doesn't acknowledge that necessities actually don't need a truth. Necessary truths don't need a truth maker. Their no necessity is their truth.
Well, water can't be H2O without God, so you're wrong there.
Well,
right.
The thing is, whether water is H2O is a necessary truth or not is perhaps a debatable point, but most would say that is a necessary truth. So, I mean, that if that's the case.
So you're saying they could be brute facts?
No. It wouldn't be a brute fact, though. That's the thing. A brute fact is a contingency that has no cause or explanation, but these are necessary truths. They're not brute facts.
Oh, okay.
Actually.
Okay.
Yeah, but I guess the question is, if they're not referring to anything outside themselves, what are they even like saying? Like
they are. Sorry.
Well, so like A equals A is, and it is the case even outside of anything else. But then how would we even be able to relate that to the things that we actually interact with? So keys equals keys. That's an instantiation of the law of identity within our reality. But it's like to say that keys equals keys is true is a instantiation of the law of identity, but into a thing that is contingent. I'm not sure.
Well, that's the problem. See, I don't think it's an instantiation in the sense that there's like some causality going on. I don't think like God is using the law of identity to make it the case that keys equal keys. Rather, it's just a necessary description that any rational mind will recognize. There is no further, it's a description. There's no further ingredient.
Wait,
it's not the case that A equals A is describing the keys, but rather it's a description of what rational minds would be able to ascertain about the keys.
Okay, it is describing the keys, but it's not like there is something out there like called the law of identity that exists, and it's like being invoked like a special ingredient to like make it the case that keys equal keys. It's rather just a description that a rational agent is forced to arrive at. It's a conclusion that a rational mind is forced to arrive at because there is no possible world where that could fail to be the case where keys equal keys. So it's not like there's some extra step. And that's the thing. The tag argument seems to
imply that there's an extra step.
Right? Like there's some extra thing, like God needs to use the laws of logic, or God needs to create them, or something. And
well, I thought he was arguing that God was necessary precondition for the laws of logic. But let me before you go on, because this is very related to the argument from eternal truth, and you seem to like that one. So what's the difference?
It's the same type of argument. I like it. Like it sounds good. It's kind of like, I mean, there are arguments that can sound good and I can see where they're convincing. But then when you see the difficulty, you're no longer convinced of their deductive nature. And it's like you come to the light and you're like, oh, that argument's not as good as I once was. That doesn't make it a bad argument, but it does prevent it from being a proof. And that's, so I'm saying, yeah, it's an argument that makes you think. It seems like it works, but I don't think it works as good as I once did.
Okay.
I think I'm misunderstanding you, because it seems to be the case that you're just sort of taking the second prong of Tyler's argument, that rather than these laws of identity are descriptions of things that actually exist in our world, rather they are descriptions of like what rational beings would be led to, given the fact that they interact with these types of things. That seems to just be saying that, okay, the laws of logic aren't ontologically based within contingent things within reality. They're rather based within the minds, which, I mean, that's where they go to like LK, because there are possible worlds where there are no contingent minds that exist. Or like human beings or things like that. There must be in all possible worlds, there must be a non-contingent mind that holds all these things to be true.
Yeah, see, that's the thing. I don't think there needs to be a mind for them at all. I don't think they exist. That's the thing.
Yeah, he demolished it, actually.
Say somebody's just totally convinced, they could just go be a Platonist and they could undermine the argument like that. Okay, that would be a way to do it. But let's just say somebody's not convinced of Platonism. Well, to me, they can just be a conceptualist and say there are no truths, but there are concepts that any rational agent will recognize. That might be kind of mysterious, but that's just the way that rationality works.
Right. He's saying it's a necessary truth. So
that would just seem to be a rebuttal to the first premise, that the laws of logic are true in all possible worlds. They're only true within the worlds with contingent minds.
No, they are true in every possible world. They don't need a mind to exist. In fact, they don't really exist. They need a mind. Only a mind can recognize them, but they also don't exist.
He's smashing the argument. I mean, he's doing a better job smashing the argument than Matt Dillon did, to tell you the truth. Because he's basically saying, as just a point of fact, no, they're necessary truth, pal. And then how do you argue with that? What's the counter to that? He's basically saying that the argument doesn't work. And he's smashing it, as far as I can tell, in this hearing successfully.
Yeah.
So I'll have to rethink it. So why do I like it so much?
The thing is, what somebody's going to want to argue, and this is what Tyler Vila and others are going to want to argue is, well, that these necessary truths, and I think this is where John's coming from, and I can sympathize with this because I held this perspective for a while. I don't think it works. You could say, well, they need to be grounded in something. They don't have to be, but in some concrete thing. However, that still entails that they have a truth maker. Now they can't have a truth maker though, because that would entail they could have failed to be the case. And if you're going to say they could have failed to be the case, they're no longer necessary truths. So at most, the argument—
Not if the truth maker is a necessary being.
No, that's—
Yeah,
no.
the truth maker is God.
Right, but here's the thing. At most, the argument gets you to Platonism. But here's the thing. Even if God, and this is a distinction that's a little bit hard to grasp, but God is not actually logically necessary. He's metaphysically necessary. These truths, though, are logically necessary. So God, I don't think God is the truth maker of them. Now, he could be. He could be. I'm not saying it can definitely
Right. Yeah.
be the
Okay.
case.
So you're saying 2 plus 2 equals 4, irrespective of God, and
Yeah.
A equals A, irrespective of God. It's a necessary truth. So it really, you're basically totally dismantling the argument.
Yeah.
You're cutting it out.
Yeah, the best
completely.
somebody can argue is that somehow God is logically necessary and these things aren't made to be because of God, but rather they're a part of God. That's the best that they would be able to argue. However, that to me undermines the argument in a different way, because now God is no longer the truth maker. So now you just say, well, we have these necessary truths that are a part of God. Okay, but then why can't somebody just be a Platonist then?
Why wouldn't God still be the truth maker if they're a part of him? Because, like, I mean, the fact that I have green eyes is a part of me, but it's like I'm the truth maker to the fact that John has green eyes.
Right. No, you could argue. I'm saying, though, if somebody agrees that God's not the truth maker, but somehow they're a part of God, like the way that, like, okay, so God's power, for example, he doesn't make himself powerful, right? It's just a part of him. They could say the law of non-contradiction isn't made true by God. It's just a part of God's rationality. They could argue that. However, that would undo the argument. But if they say God actually is the truth maker of the law of non-contradiction, that relativizes the law of non-contradiction and it undoes the argument. So it's really—
Well, that's what Matt Dillahunty argued. I don't know if you listened to him with Alex Malpass.
Oh, okay. I didn't listen to that. It's the Euthyphro problem. It's just applied to rational truths.
Right. That's what he said in the when they analyzed it. He said I could rebut that, but I don't want to go into like.
Sure.
I mean,
well, I'd be curious of what your rebuttal is.
One thing I'm somewhat confused by is the distinction between logical necessity and metaphysical necessity, because like from Anselm's argument, God would be logically necessary as well, I think, like because God exists in all possible worlds.
Yeah, some people argue that, but that's a mistake. I think God's not logically necessary because we can conceive of a world in which God doesn't exist, but he is metaphysically necessary, and that means he has to exist in every world that there can be. And that's a hard distinction for somebody to grasp, but that's a really important distinction.
Like, so like if logic, like something to be logically necessary just means that like we can conceptualize it or something like
logically
that.
Necessary means you can't conceptualize of a world in which it fails to be. No concrete thing is logically necessary, but a concrete thing can be metaphysically necessary, or what's called broad necessity, or I call it feasible necessity. Now, not everybody agrees with me on that, but I think that's the way that we need to argue, because otherwise you're going to undercut some of these arguments. So that would be one way to attack.
Yeah, you might be right. Because
I'm pretty confident that point's correct. Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of things about that make sense, because that could be part of why I always intuitively kind of I like the arguments for God, but I ultimately see that they almost always fail. And the one that I thought was the closest to the good one, you might have just demolished in this hearing.
When I used
in other words,
that was the best argument too. Or at one point I did, but yeah, I don't think it's still a good argument in that it makes you think, like the ontological argument. It really makes you think, but I don't think it works.
I certainly think it works better than the propositions, like the eternal truths of propositions, because I think the truth maker to propositions are like some sort of concrete reality. But for the laws of logic, it's if you don't hold that the truth makers to the laws of logic are some sorts of concrete realities that it's referring to, then yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess being a Platonist, you could sort of refute Tyler Vella's argument just because like these.
Well, a Platonist is a theist, right? I mean,
not necessarily. So somebody could hold that there are Platonic truths and not be, and just say that they just necessarily exist. Like it's debated whether Plato held that view. And I've met atheists who hold that perspective.
I think most moral realists now are Neoplatonists. So they're not theists, but they still hold that there's some sort of like true facts out there about how people ought to act or what's good and bad that exist independent of like
do you
anybody
think
else.
that God can be proved by argumentation?
Well, I do. I mean, I think a form of the Leibnizian cosmological argument, like, of course, I have my own version, whether it's a proof or not, any argument can be objected to, but I think that's the best route. I think it's a highly plausible argument, but it's going to depend, like any argument, it's going to depend upon somebody's intuition. So, people disagree on arguments, and oftentimes it comes down to, I think, assuming everybody's being honest, different people just have different impressions of the way things
Well,
work.
I always took it as an article of faith. Is this faith? Am I actually like faith in the negative? That
that's the
one
thing.
of these arguments was going to logically prove God, and they were going to actually work and logically prove God, just like a mathematical proof, just like a syllogistic proof. I kind of, and my thought process was that the closest one so far is the tag argument. But I'll think about what you said. You might have just smashed it. Go ahead.
The thing is that, okay, so it's not, at least according to, so I'm, coming from my Catholic tradition, the Catholic Church holds that belief in God's not an article of faith. It's actually a preamble, I think is what they say. It's actually an article of reason. So like referring to like St. Paul in Romans 1, we can know God exists through all things that are made. So actually it's not a faith-based position, it's a reason-based. Now that's controversial today because, people hundreds of years ago probably thought like Aquinas's 5 ways were airtight proofs and things, and and we didn't know about evolution. And so, there are other factors. And the church doesn't say that we can prove God in this mathematical sense, like, everybody is forced to accept it or you're irrational. But the church does teach that one can use their reason to recognize that God exists. And, you can argue how strong of a sense that is, but I think we should make our best case. I don't think that it's anything antithetical to Christianity to say that you can make a really strong argument for God. It's not going to force anybody's hand. I totally agree with you on that. And some Catholics, especially if they're more in the Thomistic vein, I think go a little bit too far, where they give people an impression that you can just definitively prove God and nobody could disagree. And I think that sets people up for some disappointment. But I think that we should be able to present an argument that can win a debate with an atheist, that can say, look, that's
strong enough that it's not an actual proof per se.
Right.
But if the atheist isn't a totally sold out baby eater, they'll yield to our powerful argumentation and reason.
Right. And I think the Leibnizian type argument, like Josh Rasmussen argues a version of this, Alexander Pruss, Fazer, of course, defends arguments in this vein, and I have my own way of arguing it, not putting myself at their level, but I think that's the best route we can go. And the thing is, that type of argument is the traditional proof that like the scholastic philosophers were arguing for. And this goes back to like Aristotle and Plato. It has a rich tradition. And the last 100 years or so, all the Christians jumped on board with the Kalam and moral argument. And these arguments are fine. They're not as good as this other argument, not as good, nearly as good. And it's a mistake. It's a mistake of Christian apologetics. And it's a mistake because most people don't study philosophy. And I don't want to sound arrogant, like different people are going to have different intuitions, but I just think it's a huge mistake.
Now, say I'm the atheist and I ask you, okay, well, how do we know the principle of sufficient reason is true, that everything that's contingent must have an explanation for its existence?
Yeah.
But how would you respond?
Sure. Well, with any given proposition, you can say this holds good explanatory value, and in absence of a strong defeater, we should accept it, and there are different discussions like that. Like I can't prove the law of non-contradiction. We can't really prove there's an external world per se, but we take these things as given. They seem to be true, especially when we're talking about the law of non-contradiction. And it's like, okay, I want to qualify. The law of non-contradiction apply to concrete things because to avoid some paradoxes. But however, I have a version that doesn't need the principle of sufficient reason. So I think you can present a version that actually doesn't need it. So
is that the solution to the liar's paradox there? That saying the law of non-contradiction has to apply only to concrete things?
It could be, yeah. So like what is it called?
Paraconsistent logic?
Yeah,
or is
paraconsistent. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, so they argue, so like Graham Priest, argues that there can be real contradictions, but to me, the examples I've heard have been like abstractions. So like maybe the liar's paradox and things like that. Like, okay, maybe, even though I'm not convinced, but I haven't really studied those things, maybe the law of non-contradiction doesn't apply to things like that. But that's not the same as saying, my computer exists and fails to exist at the same time, right? But like some people will suggest sometimes that like at the quantum level, the law of non-contradiction doesn't apply. I've never been convinced.
Fuzzy logic.
Yeah, I've never been convinced of that. I don't see how that's going to be plausible, but there are some who will suggest that. I'm not convinced by that, and there aren't many people who will take that route. But
I just started noticing there are arguments about that. I didn't look into them yet, but they're called. Go ahead.
Where like Matt Dillahunty, I'll give him credit. He called them out for that in that debate with Tyler Villa. He said people will suggest to him, oh well, quantum physics shows that the laws of logic don't always apply, and he said no, they don't. And I totally agree with him on that. Actually, like I respect that he pointed out because he's right. They may cause us to rethink things about causality, but I don't see how you're going to go from something scientific like an observation and then say that something can exist and fail to exist at the same time. And things like Schrodinger's cat and stuff like that, that's more of an abstraction. That's not literally, and I haven't studied it a ton, but
I thought it was literal. I thought that's the whole point as to why it's such a profound mystery.
Schrodinger came up with the thought experiment in order to sort of like make a case for why
it can't be true. But then it
can't be true, at least in the larger scale, the classical world that we live with.
Right, but my understanding is it is true, and it just doesn't make any sense.
It's certainly true for electrons. That like it's not the case that like electron is both in one position and also not in that same position, but it's rather like they're in a wave of possible positions, and it's only when we make some sort of measurement that we can say for sure that okay, it's in this specific position. It's not saying that it's both in a position and not in a position. It's just
I know what you're saying, and what you're saying makes complete sense. But as far as my understanding is, I'll look over this again, and we should bring this up next time we have him. Because
there's multiple interpretations of quantum mechanics. Like there's the many worlds interpretation, which would say the cat is alive in this world and not alive in some other world. And so if you want to say that that's a violation of the law of non-contradiction, I think they would just say that's not the case, because it's not saying that in one singular world, the cat is both alive and dead, but in multiple possible worlds, the cat is both alive and dead. But it's not saying that in the same world.
Which, well, I want to add so I don't know enough, and I know that some people, like, I don't want to comment too much because I know that not that much about these things, but the Schrodinger's cat example, my understanding is that it's unclear whether or not the cat is alive and dead. But the thing is that life is something that's kind of vague to begin with. I mean, philosophers debate about when is something alive and so on, but we're talking about let's just take like a particle. Can a particle exist and not exist totally at the same time? And to me, that is just obviously false. There are suggestions that a particle can exist in two different places at the same time. But what's the contradiction in that? I mean, the Catholic Church argues that some saints have done that, for example. I'm not saying that proves it, but I'm saying is there's no actual logical contradiction in that. So that's a pretty high burden to prove that the law of non-contradiction has been violated. Merely bringing up some odd examples of the quantum realm that may cause us to rethink physics and causality and so on. But to say that entails that the law of non-contradiction has been violated, that's a pretty high burden that somebody has to shoulder.
Yeah.
Right. The one.
Go ahead, Craig.
Well, the one thing we don't have time to go into it now, but when you come back, because this was actually an awesome conversation, by the way. It's been almost 2 hours. There's a whole thing that I started thinking about with superpositions, and you can actually apply it in Christianity, where prior to action there's a sea of potentialities, and then once action is taken, and I'll get into it the next time you're here.
No, I think you're probably right. Like, I think there's a way in which you can sort of map Aristotelian like potential and actuality onto quantum mechanics, at least in a way that sort of allows it to make sense. That like it's almost like grounding potentiality in something like real, in a sense, like potential particles are actually interacting with other potential particles, and then they're causing some sort of interference pattern or something like that.
Well, but it could also explain why there are passages in the Bible that say like those who God foreknew, because the reason why hard Calvinists exist is because there are passages in the Bible that back up their interpretation of the scripture, that God chose you and turned on the light and sovereignly. And if you factor in superpositions, which is prior to action, there is I don't know exactly how to say this, but like a superposition is potentiality prior to action. And once you act, then you set into motion chains of being. So in other words, God could be omniscient and know what you're going to do, and you're in a superposition, and God is in the superposition prior to you acting, and God could respond sovereignly according to all of your actions. Don't know if that made sense, but when I work it out, I will. I don't know if it made sense just as I said it.
I think I kind of understand what you're getting at. I mean, Phaser definitely has argued of mapping this language of active potency onto the quantum realm, and has argued they fit fairly well. But I'd love to deconstruct Calvinism, and I had a debate with Ross Burns on Converse channel a couple of months ago, and I thought that was a pretty good discussion, and he's a Calvinist of some sort.
Did you argue over free will?
Yeah. I totally disagree with Calvinism. I can grant that Romans 9 does seem to prima facie support their position.
Right, that's exactly the point. Yes.
Outside of that, I mean, their arguments, I think, don't work philosophically.
Their arguments don't work. My only point is, but the only point is I'm gonna make is that it's possible for God to be totally sovereign over all your decisions, and you to be totally sovereign at the exact same time. It's a paradox. It's not a logical contradiction.
Yeah.
And when you factor in superpositions and potentialities, then you can see it, because God could be sovereign in his responses to your desire, and allow you to act only insofar as you wanted to act. Again,
it depends upon how you would argue it. But if you're arguing, well, I don't. I mean, I wouldn't take the route though. If you're going to argue like, and I'm not saying you are, but if you're going to argue like it seems like a contradiction, but it's really not, I wouldn't go that route. But if you're going to argue something like synergistic, I mean, I would agree.
Yeah, you could like probably the Calvinists could make the case that like similar to how a general makes an order for his troops and then the troops act on that order. The troops are acting according to their own will, and they're also acting according to the general's will. And so there's kind of an instance of these two sort of wills happening without like free will sort of being violated.
Right. Well, because the Bible also says that God gave you over to the desires of your heart. So free will isn't violated, even if God is totally sovereign over your actions, because they can be synergistic if you grant God omniscience.
Yeah, so I think that's the thing is like there's a difference between God causing something to occur or God allowing something to occur.
Yes, totally. And there's no contradiction there is the point. Right. God allowing something to occur, that's not and it maps up with his theology, his fallen world theology. That's why I like his fallen world theology, because God can allow something to occur, be sovereign over it, and allow it only up to a point, which the Bible actually kind of says. He gives you over to the desire of your heart only up to a point, and then there's limited actions. There's a whole bunch of cool stuff here. I like this guy, John. Let's have him on again.
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah,
this was good, man. We got to wrap it up. It's been
well, I would love to discuss all of that predestination stuff more. I have big problems with Calvinism, and all that. So
Yeah,
Are
and
you streaming this Sunday, Caleb?
well, I moved my day because nobody was showing up on Sunday. I was all by myself except Mind Onion, I think, in the chat. But yeah, it's Thursday, so I'll try to stream tomorrow night and not around 9 if I can. But yeah, not Sunday though.
Cool. Okay.
Also, I don't know if JB's still in the chat, but I would love for you guys to chat together. That would be his introduction.
Yeah.
This was really cool, man. I thought this was awesome. You actually, it seems like you have a pretty thorough education in philosophy, just from my talking to you.
Yeah, I studied it more on my own than in the education I got from college, but yeah, I've studied it for a while.
So, John, you want to say any closing remarks?
Yeah, I don't know. go subscribe to his channel. Go listen to his debates that he's done. He had this excellent debate between Ben Watkins and the moderator. That was on Converse Contenders channel. The moderator there was impeccable, I'm sure. So yeah.
The moderator, I heard that moderator was totally awesome.
Who told you that? Oh yeah.
You told me that. What was the things that you told us to check out? Okay, there's a Josh Rasmussen, is that his name?
Okay, I'll run through it. Okay, so Josh Rasmussen had a dialogue on capturing Christianity with Lance Hannestead, I think.
Yeah, I'm gonna watch that for sure.
Watch that for sure.
And a Trent Doherty thing.
Yeah, Trent Doherty's book. If you can get it for the library, but like it's expensive. It's a good book though.
How much is it?
It starts at $60 at minimum.
$60?
Yeah. It was more than that. It was like $100 average. I got it from
John,
the
can I borrow $100, John?
No, I got it from that's the problem with some of these academic books. The publishers publish it at such a high cost because they're not going to be like bestsellers or whatever. But yeah, it's ridiculous.
Wow, that's John will get it. John's rich, but
yeah, and I'm hoping to publish. It's a book, but it's more of an essay. I'm hoping to publish my arguments so people can read them and I don't have to, piece them together with YouTube videos. So that'll be soon too.
It might be good too, like maybe even as a promotional material for your book or essay, is doing some sort of like YouTube video on its own, just to sort of go out over the simplified version of the arguments and then sort of say how you're gonna.
Yeah, I kept remaking. So I had a bunch of slides explaining some of these arguments, but I don't think it was kind of making sense totally, and it's just too difficult to do over a video. So
yeah.
Well, some of the stuff is some of the pages you're on, I think are really sharp. So I think that like you gave a lot of, if people are still listening, I don't know, but you gave a lot of food for thought in this particular sit down. You covered a lot of ground. There's a lot of,
Well, and I'm open to having dialogue with anybody. That's why I'm holding streams, because sometimes it's hard for people to get on, modern day debate or whatever. You have to kind of get in line and so on. But I want to have a hangout for anybody who wants to stop by to hash things out. And it's hard to get people on because some people, don't want to be on camera and whatever. But yeah, that's what I'm looking to have dialogues with people so that we can hash out arguments and make progress in apologetics and everything.
Yeah, well, I'll definitely pop by on your channel and we'll have you back relatively soon. And I'll comment on some point I'll make a video on what we just talked about here and your arguments and stuff.
All right.
So.
All right, you want to sign us out, Craig?
Yeah, well, thank you everybody for showing. You see it here. We got the future of apologetics right here in front of your face. You're like, God, these guys are so philosophically inept, and then we bring this like totally philosophically astute, this total philosophical fucking first-rate astute, near genius, and we blew everybody away. Well, we're closing in on it, my friend. No, I thought this was an awesome chat. Went about as well as I could have thought. So thank you all for coming, and watch your back, atheists. We're coming for you. This is what we're working on in our spare time. So get ready, kids.
All right, bye.
See you guys.
Yeah.
Are we
All
off?
right.